This show is sponsored by Audible. Fans of It Matters can get a 30-day free trial of Audible Premium Plus. Stay tuned after our interview for details. Hello, and welcome to It Matters How We Treat One Another, the social science show. I'm your host, Matthew David Vasco. If you subscribe to this show on YouTube or your favorite podcasting platform, then thank you. We are grateful for each and every one of our subscribers. We're also thankful for our patrons on Patreon. Your support helps to make this episode possible. My guest this episode is Dr. Leah Hollon. Dr. Hollon is a naturopathic physician, author, educator, and expert in holistic medicine, epigenetics, and lineage healing. She will be discussing intergenerational and transgenerational trauma and healing with me. But first, our inspiring news. If inspiring things are happening in your neck of the woods, then please send us a direct message on one of our social media accounts and let us know. You can find us by our show name on Facebook, Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. This time, our inspiring news comes from goodnewsnetwork.org and is exciting news about sewage. I bet you didn't know there could be exciting news about sewage, but yes, there can be. And the headline reads, researchers develop way to get natural gas that's renewable directly from sewage. It seems researchers have discovered a way to treat sewage sludge that requires less energy and has the added benefit of producing usable, renewable natural gas. Here's a quote from the article. The Washington State University team described the process this week in Chemical Engineering Journal, touting it as a way to help communities sustainably clean their waste while providing renewable natural gas for their energy needs. When the researchers pre-treated sludge collected from a nearby wastewater facility, they produced 200% more renewable natural gas compared to current practices, and cut the cost of disposal by nearly 50%. End quote. This renewable natural gas can be used in the same ways that traditional non-renewable natural gas can be, and who knows, maybe in time it could even be used to power the very same sewage treatment plants where it is produced. It's inspiring to think that perhaps in time, sewage treatment could become an energy-neutral process. Again, if you know of inspiring things happening in your area, then please DM us on our socials and let us know. Thanks. Up next is our feature segment. But first, I want to take a moment to welcome our new sponsor, Gevi. Established in 2017, Gevi is quickly becoming world-renowned for their compact appliances that provide practical kitchen solutions. Say, for example, that your refrigerator's ice maker quit working, but you don't want to spend thousands of dollars on a new refrigerator. Simply get yourself the Gevi countertop ice maker. They also have wonderful compact coffee makers and espresso machines. Check the link in our episode description today to take advantage of their Mother's Day sale. And now, our feature segment. Dr. Leah Hollon is a naturopathic physician, educator, and expert in holistic medicine, epigenetics, and lineage healing. She is a multiple award-winning author whose work integrates science and compassion to help individuals address deep health challenges rooted in intergenerational and transgenerational trauma. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Thanks for being here. I am so, first of all, I should just say that I loved your book.
Oh,
I,
thank you.
I have to admit, I haven't finished it yet, but I
Okay.
started it and I'm working my way through it. And you're so personable. Like, I
Oh,
just love how personable you are in the book. It's kind of a, uh, heady topic, pretty
yeah,
scientific, a lot of science,
yeah.
and yet, you make it accessible. You bring it down to earth for us. So thank you for that.
That was the intention. Thank you so much. I'm glad that it hit well. That's the most important thing is you can talk about science all day long, but if it doesn't translate, it's not going to help many people, right? Yeah.
Right. It really seems like a book that works both for a medical professional and the lay person as well, I would say. Don't you
Yeah.
have you found that to be true?
Yeah, that was definitely the intention. And I actually when I was writing it, I kind because I teach too, I got to the end of each of the chapters and I was like, it's a lot of information. Like, how could I help bring it back? And that's when I kind of at the end of each chapter have like, summing it up and I have a case to try to help reintegrate that information and then also pose questions for people like food for thought. So I felt like that kind of helped people kind of put a, you know, kind of a cherry on top.
I thought that also made it like the perfect book for a book club too. Right?
We,
Because you give people talking things to kind of,
yeah.
food for thought, things to get them talking
Yeah.
a little bit and stuff.
Oh my gosh, I love that. I was just having a luncheon with my team today before this, and we were talking about book clubs. And somebody was like, "Hey, we can maybe do a book club with it." And I said, "Hey, I do know somebody who could do a book club with it for a Zoom. I do, every once in a while I'll do that." But yeah, I think it gets people talking because healing happens in communities. Like we can heal individually, but we know that the healing is exponential when we have a group to heal with.
Excellent. That's so true. I think, we undervalue in our modern age how much connection matters, right?
Yeah.
Isn't that true? I mean, we kind of get caught up in our day to day and fast paced life and things, but to sit down with a group of people and
Mm.
really comb through a rich topic like your book. Why don't you give us the title of your book as long as we're talking about it? Because everybody listening is going to be like, well, just tell us the
Is this
name.
they're like, what is this book? It's called Unwinding the Imprints of Disease, Transforming Intergenerational and Transgenerational Trauma.
And
I know
that's
it's a little,
that's we're going to get into that today.
yeah,
We're going to really delve into that topic. But first, I wanted to start out a little broader, if that's okay. And my
sure.
first question is simply, how does trauma show up in the body?
Mm. This is such a yummy question because it can show up in so many ways for people. And I think that that's why for so long people just felt like, oh, I have this thing, right? And they don't know why they're feeling a certain way or they've tried 10 or 15 drugs and something's not working. And then they have an amazing person who sits down with them, whether it's a counselor or, someone within their culture and background and says, hey, have you thought about trauma before? And then it kind of opens that up. And so what we know in the science, it's just now catching up with what we've felt in social perspectives for a really long time. You've probably heard about, different folks who have had trauma, right? And I think for a lot of folks that I work with, they think trauma or even PTSD has to be that you were on the battlefield, that you were actually serving in a war. And
Mm,
that's not the case. What we do know is that about 80-ish% of people are going to have some type of trauma in their life, but only about 10% does it become something like PTSD. So if you're able to move through it, which most people can, but some folks can't, but it can show up anything like bad sleep,
oh,
also having anxiety, depression. It can show up of really just having a lack of confidence that can show up for some people because if something's happened really bad, um, it's harder for them to connect the same way. We were talking about the importance of connection, right? They don't want to
mm,
do things as much. But I find that it can even be pain. So headaches, they can have heightened allergies. We can even see for in biological females that they may skip a menstrual cycle or they may even have issues with getting pregnant. We can see issues of infertility. It can show up in so many different systems of the body. And I think that's why it can be so nebulous and confusing for people.
Mm,
Um, but I think the trick is that whether it shows up on the nervous system, like maybe through your brain chemicals feeling off or more anxious or depressed or sleep being off, or if it shows up through chronic infections that you keep getting, you can't really get over them, or if it shows up even within the endocrine system, which would be our hormonal system, where all those things I talked about, how our, even our glucose could be off, right? So if that has happened, a lot of people they're just not sure what to do, right? The main key is that they're not responding to therapy. Like
mm,
they can't get, like maybe 10 people have been put on a similar drug and they're not responding favorably, or they've done a certain treatment, it's not they're not responding. And I see that a lot for people is that, they show up in my office oftentimes and they've seen 15 specialists. Well, it's because it's not just on the physical body, right? You
mhm,
can see it in lab work sometimes, like if you see a lot of fight and flight responses, or we call PTSD, we can actually measure it. There's so many ways to actually measure that. But, I think there's a lot of relief for people when I'm like, hey, let's go back. When all this started happening, like the migraines and all the allergy, responses, and you're not sleeping, tell me what else was going on. And they're like, oh, yeah. Well, my mother and my father both died around that time. And I
mhm,
wasn't expecting that. And I had also been the caregiver for my brother who, has a disability. I mean, it's those kinds of things where it's like layers on layers for people. So I think that, again, in the research, we find that it can set up on pretty much any system. But the difference is that if you're not, it's really if you're not responding. And so then that's when we kind of know that it's on a deeper level of true trauma versus just like, hey, you had a stressor and maybe it's gone into something like a PTSD.
I see. So for let's dive a little into the book now.
Sure.
And for our listeners who don't know what intergenerational and transgenerational trauma are, can you kind of go into those a little bit for us just to kind of open up the topic and get us started? Again, for those people who may not be familiar with those two things,
Yeah.
inter and transgenerational trauma.
Yeah, most definitely. So, intergenerational trauma is basically where there's a trauma of our ancestors. So, usually just one generation, our parents, and the trauma that they experienced actually is being imprinted on the child. So that would be us. So one generation. Well, then transgenerational trauma is that it can span multiple generations. So, for a lot of folks, they probably heard of the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. We say all
Mm-hmm.
these sayings, we also know that within certain types of cultures and even sacred texts that they've referred to this of if we're talking about maybe from a Christian perspective, like sins of the father. And I don't think it's so much of sins of the father as much as it is as imprints of the parent. Like there's
Mm-hmm.
imprints that are being carried on. And so, again, I recognize that's my perspective, but it's kind of what I see within medicine and also within working with folks on a social perspective as well. But what we have found about these traumas that get imprinted is that it has to be significant. It has to be something that is sort of equivalent to PTSD,
Mm-hmm.
where basically the psyche is changed, where the body goes into fight and flight. And when we're in fight and flight, it's supposed to be temporarily. But for something like a significant trauma like PTSD, and let's go ahead and use maybe an example of some of our military war veterans who have been there, um, we can actually see that it changes what we call the HPA axis. That is the hypothalamus, which is a gland in the brain, the pituitary, which is also a gland in the brain, and then the adrenals. And the adrenals sit on top of our kidneys on our back. And so this HPA axis is really the conductor and the regulator of what's going on. So it knows if we are having to run from a bear and it says, oh, stranger danger, let's get running. So we increase glucose, we increase a lot of different things within the body so that we can actually run from the bear. But the problem is with PTSD, even for our veterans, is that that switch doesn't turn back off to a normal. It stays heightened. And when we stay in that heightened state, it changes the brain chemicals and the receptors of the brain.
Hmm.
So it really changes. We can see that on imaging. We can see that the dopamine receptors and the dopamine regulation has changed. We can see also that in norepinephrine and epinephrine in their urine. Um, and we also see that it affects their immune system. So unfortunately, for a lot of our veterans who are combat war veterans, they are on far more medication for the same disease states as like the normal population. So if they happen to have diabetes, and there's a lot of folks, in our culture who have diabetes, they're on far more medication in order to make it work for them. And so we recognize that there's a significant difference. So we also find that they're having a harder time with their immune proteins to regulate their immune system. And we also find that their endocrine system has changed. They're at higher risk for certain types of even cancers and even hormones not being regulated appropriately. And again, glucose not being, because that's part of the endocrine system too. And so what we can see is that their children also are having some of these imprints. So I'll take an example. There's something called telomeres. Telomeres are the caps at the end of our chromosomes, and they are related to health or to disease. And the longer those caps are, we see a relationship of health, longevity, reduced disease. But as they shorten, what we see is more disease, a shorter lifespan, and even things like cancer. And so what we find is in especially POWs, and this is where a lot of the research around intergenerational and transgenerational trauma has been taken, is from combat war veterans, POWs, and even families of the Holocaust. That's where a lot of the research got started, and now it's expanded to things like Katrina, 9/11, Khmer Rouge, that kind of thing. But kind of going back to that is that we see these significant changes when they have been under stress, fight and flight responses, and they're stuck in PTSD. And what we see is those telomeres, those caps, shorten. Their lifespan is shortened. And we see that it also is the same for their children. So this is significant information to think about. I mean, it's really, where does sacredness separate from DNA? I don't know if it really does. I think the more that I do this, I feel like there's a true sacredness in our code
Mm.
of holding these messages. And, we can also look at what we call famine genes. I call it that. But we have families, even from Dutch famine studies, even during World War I and World War II, where because we had a generation or two that were in famine conditions, it basically sent a signal to their children
Mm.
of kind of hold on to whatever you can because you don't know when you're going to eat again. Well, now you look at our culture and we have all this excess. And I think that that's a big part. And that's what we see in the research is that sort of these famine genes, for lack of a way, doesn't really keep up with our current state of affairs and of the kinds of foods that we're taking in. And so what we have actually found is that these famine genes actually can put us at a higher risk for certain types of diabetes or metabolic disease.
Wow.
Yeah, as a signal. Again, it's, if you think about it, the DNA code, if it's, again, thinking about it more um, from a social perspective, it's like stranger danger, you better run, right?
Mm.
Like trying to protect the lineage to keep going. Because again, we know that, fight and flight's a real thing. And, depending on what you believe in science about kind of survival of the fittest, right?
Mm.
And what is fittest? It's that you're still being able to carry on to the next lineage. So I think there's a lot of beauty in thinking about these studies. And I feel so grateful for the folks that have done these studies so that we really do understand what can happen in our bodies and how we can mirror it. I'll give another example. So there's also studies that are done on females who have undergone some type of significant trauma. And that would be things like, unfortunately, like physical or sexual abuse. And what they found is that it made a significant difference, not just in their ability to get pregnant, but also they saw heightened brain chemicals in their children that matched them, and their brains matched exactly in certain areas of the dopamine regulation and upregulation. And also even the size of the brain. So if there was loss of matter, like white or gray matter, we saw that also, that it had shrunk. So it's really, again, the body will mirror, the child tries to mirror what's going on for mom because that's like a baseline. So we find also that if mom's cortisol is really low after a significant trauma like PTSD, it will oftentimes do that. Our cortisol is a hormone that's made by the adrenal glands to help us, be able to do work throughout the day. And then it goes down at night so we can sleep. But if that gets dysregulated from trauma, it'll be flatlined. And it's really hard for people. We can see a lot of postpartum depression for some women. But what we see is that the child will match this exactly.
Hmm.
That is very interesting. And the reason that that's important is cortisol is in charge of our immune system, obviously our sleep, our repair. That's why we sometimes give steroids is because people have gotten sick and they don't have enough cortisol around to kind of get over that infection. So I know I dove in deep there, but I get really excited about how we can actually track it on the body for people and give them information.
Well, that leads me just perfectly to my next question, which is, does trauma we experience directly show
Mm.
up differently in the body from intergenerational or transgenerational trauma?
Yeah, yeah. So what we find, there's two parts to this, is let's say, for instance, you happen to be from a family who did experience genocide. That resilience we see within like the autonomic nervous system can be different than a family who did not experience genocide, right? It kind of
Uh,
makes sense, right? Like, so that resilience factor. So we can see that in the brain chemicals, the hormones, all the things that we kind of talked about, even the immune proteins. Um, and so like if you happen to have layers of trauma, right? Like on top of that, it's almost like what we call chronic or compound PTSD for some people. So I mean, I have lots of folks who they have a very humble upbringing. Maybe they were raised in a family where there was a lot of abuse or alcoholism. That's one of the things that we can also trace as alcoholism kind of markers. But I have a fair amount of families that I see that are their children are adopted. And we can really see this for like if they were cocaine or crack babies or even meth babies. I see that oftentimes. And so there's a different sometimes resilience factor or like a baseline or framework. And so if that body in the background kind of knows fight and flight very well, it's very easy to go into that state and we go into a heightened response of fight and flight. And so that can compound things. But then we have other folks that they have a trauma, right? And there's not a lot of chronic things there. So we do have some people who are a little bit more at risk for having probably more of a challenging way or navigating things. But I've seen amazing things happen for people where I'm like, how did they walk out of this? This is incredible, right? And I mean, I constantly am humbled and inspired by my patients that I work with. And I feel like it's a team approach, and getting to see them heal is just incredible from these types of things. But yeah, so I think the main thing is if we have a trauma, even this is very interesting, is different developmental stages of a child. So let's say, for instance, a child, there's no known maybe familial trauma that we can think of or know of. But let's say, for instance, the child's parent dies when they're 5 years old. That's a significant time when the immune system is building. And if that trauma kind of happens, then the child may be at a higher risk for having vulnerability within their immune system.
mm,
And so if they're in front of me, maybe they're age 40 and now they're having chronic like infections, like maybe pulmonary infections, specifically, let's say it's pneumonia or bronchitis, we may have to go back to that stage of development and really kind of focus on that for a period of time. So it's really kind of a beautiful thing to think that if a trauma happened at a certain time, you might approach it differently. Like between ages 0 and 2, you might do something else. That's really when the adrenals are being fully matured. Whereas if it's around 18 years old, you're looking at more of the neurological system. So you can be even more targeted in your approach.
Oh, wow. Um, is it possible that a person could be carrying around intergenerational or transgenerational trauma and not know it?
Yes. And that was the beauty of, I think, how I got into this work. I have seen this many times, and it's really comes from taking a really good history. In med school, they always said, the most important thing was taking a good history, and I have to agree. We can have all the bells and whistles with labs and things like that, but really, at the end of the day, it's a good history. And I see this many, many times, and that's what I wanted to share with the world was this information of like, maybe the reason you're not healing is because this isn't yours. You are
Mm,
the proxy for your family, whether we want to call it through just the DNA, right? And we can go through the mechanics of how that even happens. But there are a lot of people that I see, and they're like, I don't understand. I'm the one in the family that's like the weirdo. They'll say that those are exact words
mm,
of, I don't understand why I'm the one that has two autoimmune diseases. I've had cancer. I'm the one that takes care of the family all the time. It's those kinds of things. And so I see that quite often. I would say one of what really got me into writing this book was I was sitting with a patient, and this was when I was back on the West Coast, and she had been having a lot of issues around sleep.
mm,
And I mean, sleep. I mean, who hasn't had some issues with sleep at some point? Like we know that that's one of the top chronic issues for people in the United States. So that's a very common thing that we see. But this was different because her primary care doctor had put her on a drug that really she should have only been on for 8 weeks. That's what it requires, is really about that time frame. She had been on it for over 10 years.
oh,
And
wow.
she was having such severe issues with sleep. And it was usually not falling asleep, but staying asleep. And she would wake up but the problem was, yeah, she just couldn't get off of the drug, and that's why she had come to me. So we just kind of wanted to explore that. So she's talking to me. I said, let's revisit this again. I want to hear this a little bit more. And I said, so are you having dreams? And she's like, oh, yeah, I'm having dreams. And I was like, okay, tell me a little bit about it. She's like, they're nightmares. They're horrible. I don't even know what to
Mm,
do with them. And I said, please tell me if it feels okay or appropriate. And so she shared with me that the dreams didn't feel like her own. I asked her, I said, do they feel like yours, or they feel like, you haven't seen on TV, right? No,
mm,
nothing that you've seen somebody else. No, I haven't seen that. And she said, well, I keep seeing very concerning um, pictures of things being in this, basically dead people being out in a hot area in the sand. And it's very, I see fire, I see, demolition. I don't know what's going on, but it's very upsetting. And I said, okay, well, do you know of anybody who's had this? And she said, no. I said, well, I want you to go back to your family. Let's put a pin in this for right now, but we're going to come back to this. I want you to go to your family and ask if anybody knows anything about this. It was just one of those moments where you're sitting with somebody and like this is one of the most important things that I may witness in my life. And it's like the full body chills. So I
mm,
asked her to go back. And sure enough, it was her father's experiences that had happened. He had never shared it with her because a lot of folks who have trauma, they don't want to talk about it. They
mm,
hide it. There's shame, right?
right.
And so, sure enough, he was a scout in the Golan Heights, Night of the Bridges, the whole thing. And he was basically trying to find landmines. And this is what he had seen is he had seen people injured severely who had
Mm,
also passed in the sand.
mm,
And he had never spoken it to his
mm,
daughter ever.
wow.
And so she was having his dream. Basically, her dreams were his experience, his lived experience. And even the Veterans Affairs has shared that children and grandchildren can have the dreams of true experiences of their family member that was in combat war.
Fascinating.
So now the science is catching up, right? So this was
Hmm.
really the major chill moment where I wanted to share that people may not know that they're carrying this. Yeah. And I
Mhm.
usually see it through a lot of children.
I see. You see adults and children?
I do. Yeah. And I mean, I have one gal who has a very unique experience where her parents were both covert agents
Oh.
and what happened for her in her life. And, you know, it was her experience is amazing in the work that she has done to heal herself. And,
Mm.
you it takes a brave family to be covert agents. Let's say
Yeah.
that, right? And it
Right.
also takes a brave person to also look into that and be like, yeah, it stops with me. And I know that this is what I want to heal. And I think there's a lot of relief that happens for people. They're like, I finally feel seen.
Mm.
Like I finally feel seen. And
Mhm.
so, yeah, I know. A pretty amazing story.
Along that line, what might a first visit to you look like from the patient perspective? What kind of things do you delve into in a first appointment? What kind of things are you looking for?
Yeah, so usually when I'm sitting down with a patient, I do like to spend a fair amount of time with them. And I see folks for a lot of rare or what we would consider maybe complex disease states. Sometimes it's genetic conditions. And so I really want to make sure we have adequate time to be with them. It's very important. And especially if they've had trauma, which again, a lot of the folks that I see have had trauma. So it's usually at least 2 hours for my first time that I sit down with someone and we go over, obviously their past medical history. So I'm curious about how they've responded with past infections. I want to try to find the vulnerable place for them. So like
Mhm.
if they had like if they had 3 whole years of chronic ear infections, like I want to know that even if they were like age 5, I want to know
Mm.
that. How they responded to other types of infections. Can they get a fever? Like I'm really trying to learn their body like a mechanic of a car. Like I
Mhm.
really want to know like what their sleep is like. So the past medical history is really important, but the family history is just as important because that's where we can start seeing some of these potential mutations where that have gotten passed down through the lineage.
Mhm.
Especially around drug therapy. Again, with my background, I do teach in pharmacy. And most folks within pharmacy, their desire is to not have people on a bunch of drugs, but sometimes people are on drugs, right? Like that's just the
Mhm.
way that it is. And they may not be actually able to metabolize the drug, and that can be inherited. So we can actually do certain types of testing to determine if the drug that they're on is even working for them. So, like if you have someone who comes in for breast cancer and they're not tolerating, something like tamoxifen or another type of drug that we might use for women who are over even age 50 and if it's not working, we can actually do testing and actually tag that and figure out why it's not and maybe choose a better drug for them that they can utilize. So we could take 10 people and everybody's breaking it down different. We have people who
Mhm.
are what we call slow metabolizers, intermediate metabolizers, kind of regular metabolizers, and ultra rapid metabolizers. So that's like, if you've ever had people say, oh man, I can't drink hardly any coffee. I'm up
Mhm.
all night, right?
Mhm.
Or people who are like, oh, I can drink coffee at 9:30 at night. And you're like, what is going on here? We're all different and we inherit that. And including what we were talking about, like we can see certain types of cancers be inherited, certain types of autoimmune disease inherited, even trauma sort of passed down. But we can also see the way in which we detoxify or break down drugs can be the same. So if I can figure that out, then
Mhm.
oftentimes that really leads me down a really good pathway to figure out the best therapies for them. Because again, I'll have people come in and they're like, I've been put on every drug and failed every drug, and I don't know what to do.
Mhm.
Help me.
Yeah. So are you looking on that first visit, are you looking at might you also like take a blood sample or something and do a blood test? I mean, this seem
Yeah.
are because you're thinking both mentally and physically, right? So
Yeah.
you're at that crossroads,
Yeah.
right? So
It's
you're
great.
spending time with them and you want to hear their full medical history
Mm-hmm.
and probably different psychological things that they've experienced. But then are you also running some tests as
Quantifier.
well?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, I think like you point out, like it's important to have your hands in all of that, right? So it's if it's on the social aspect or the emotional aspect, and then also the physical and chemical. So, if labs are needed, we do those. Oftentimes their primary care will send them to me or specialists. So I already have a lot of labs, but if we
Mm,
need specialty labs, we get those. I will say for naturopathic medicine, not all of the country is licensed. So in certain states we are unlicensed and licensed. So there's different scopes of practice that we can do. So the nice thing is within the state of Virginia, even though we're not licensed like other states, I have wonderful other colleagues who I work very closely with, whether it's primary care specialists, oncologists, that they we've known each other for a really long time and we can get what we need for folks if they need it. So if people are seeing folks for like naturopathic medicine in other states, there's a wide range of scope of practice where they could even serve as a primary care for other folks.
mm, okay.
Yeah.
I was just curious if you might have a story of intergenerational, transgenerational healing that you
Mm.
might like to share with us. You brought up the story, for example, of the daughter of someone who had been in the military. How does healing look in a situation like
Mhm.
that? How do you heal that kind of trauma?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very individualized for each person. I think that, what works for one may not work for another, which I know sounds like an umbrella, but I think that there's some core things that we can do regardless of where someone is on that spectrum. I think a lot of the work that you're doing, even with your podcast, of just having a listening ear is a huge part of someone's healing. In the research related to healing trauma, this is one of the biggest things is getting it out, talking about it, sharing it, whether it's through pen and paper or through song or through a community. Having someone be able to tell their story is oftentimes the first step. For some of our folks that are combat war veterans, it is a little bit more challenging. They're maybe willing to write it down on paper or to do art. They don't
Mm,
really want to talk about it too much. And we have to honor the process of where someone is. So we do oftentimes meet someone where they are. Like I
mm,
have some folks that they're like, hey, I want to gab it up and I want to talk about it. Sometimes, though, when we gab it up, we're re traumatizing ourselves because we're going back through that thing. And so we have to
mm,
really be very intentional about the way in which we are telling the story, right? Just have to get it out. For some people, it's music. What we know is with that HPA axis, we have a vagus nerve. The vagus nerve runs from the head in the center all the way down through the throat, the chest, all the way into the GI system, and all the way into our genital tissues. And if we can regulate this, whether it's through telling our story, or singing or music, we know that this actually resets the vagus nerve. So that can be one form of healing, but there are so many options. We see meditation is probably one of the most important. Now, again, having the right tools to do that is a big one. But we know that even by thoughts alone, we can either make our body sicker or we can make it healthier.
mm,
And we just haven't been given the tools to do that. And there's in chapter 9, I go through many tools. I talk about things like neurofeedback and biofeedback. My goal was to put tools in people's hands that they could do that's low hanging fruit. Even, thinking about, I talked about song, even movement, dance, there's lots of things. But we find that, again, once you tell your story,
mm,
that this is when things start opening up and then you can kind of line up the best therapies. And you asked more specifically about healing. I was thinking a lot about this because there's a lot of stories within the book of people healing themselves and their lineage. One that comes to mind is really at the beginning about Grace, and I call her Grace. That's not her real name. I've changed everybody's names and they've given me permission to do that, but her name is Grace and her story is really beautiful. And I'll share that and then one other. So she was not one of our military folks that has had PTSD. She had had what we called adverse childhood experiences. So we know in the research that adverse childhood experiences are equivalent to PTSD. So again, if someone loses a parent early in life or they're a caregiver for their parent, basically they had to grow up very, very quickly. And all of a sudden, like there's a lot happening in their body. So she was one of those. Her mother had severe mental health illness and she took care of her. Her mother was pretty much living on the sofa her
Mm.
entire life as a child growing up. She felt very responsible. She was an only child. And so her mother had also had significant trauma in her background. Her
Mm.
mother actually passed away from small bowel cancer. She was with her through the whole process. Her father also died of cancer. It was kidney cancer.
Mm.
And and so again, there was a lot in her early childhood, and then also her parents who had had also their own trauma. So Grace actually was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer when she was about 38 years old, had
Mm.
two children, young children. She was in the midst of a separation with her husband. And to be honest with you, she was doing great. But she kept realizing she was going back to that old pattern of taking care of people and being the
Mm.
fixer and right?
Sure.
Yeah. And so a number of years later, after she had many people in her life pass away unexpectedly, lots of grief came up. Again, these layers that we talked about already. Another diagnosis of cancer. This time it was stage 4.
Mm.
Now, shortly after that, within about a year and a half of her re-diagnosis. I mean, of course, we were working very hard. Again, it's not just about doing physical work, right, with her oncologist and doing chemo or radiation and that kind of thing, but also really you're working to help reprogram the brain of the old, right? Because
Mm.
thoughts can actually affect our immune proteins. They can affect in way in which even the glucose is being regulated. And we know through certain types of even meditation that we can upregulate hundreds of genes. So why not go there too, right?
Mm.
So it's a multifaceted approach. So again, folks that also have cancer, oftentimes by the first oncology visit, 30 to 50% of them are nutrient deficient. Well, if they go into chemotherapy and radiation like that, it's much harder for them to respond favorably and can actually build up drug resistance. We don't want that. So we were making sure that all the nutrients were on board the way that they needed to, that we had her eating and again, looking at diet. I mean, we look at all of that stuff. So we were doing the emotional pieces, and then her son ended up having a lot of issues at school and he tried to commit suicide. So this was one
Mm.
of those moments where I was like, if the wheels are going to come off the bus, this is when it's going to happen. And she just kept at it. And it was
Mm.
just like, I mean, I say in there how proud I am of her. And like, I saw her, I guess it was about 3 weeks ago, and like, she is living her best life. And if, someone like that who has had intergenerational trauma, who's had compound complex trauma, and, she has knit herself together a beautiful
Mm.
quilt. I mean, just I have so much admiration and love for her. And those are the things like that I get really inspired by of just like, how can you not just love that and root for someone in such beautiful ways? I mean, it's incredible to see them heal. And of course, yes, we're a team. And yes, my job is to keep her inspired. And yes, my job is to help her show up. And I think counseling was obviously a big thing for her. So it's multifaceted. And then the other case that really stands out is I have a veteran, also female, um, 70 years old, who
Mm.
she had, from her line of work, she did a lot of things she can't talk about. And processed bodies worked with lots of chemicals. And because of that, it had put a large strain on her body of damage over time.
Mhm.
The things that she was exposed to affected her immune system. She was also around high um, environments of radiation.
Mm.
And what this caused was what we call pituitary apoplexy, where basically the pituitary that governs so many things in our body
Mm.
kind of implodes, basically. And so there were all these little pieces. And so for that, it's life threatening. They didn't know she was going to live. And so They had to have her on all kinds of different hormones. I mean, if you guys out there don't know what the pituitary does, just, Google it or whatever. And next thing you're going to see is all the things that it does. So
Mm.
the fact that she was still walking around was amazing. Well, over time, working on her trauma, um, and also lots of trauma in the lineage. We're talking at least 3 generations back. Um, she was also never so glad to get out of her house at age 16, 17, because again, what was going on in her household. And so over time and working with her and following her body, I think that's the other thing is not just their story, but following their body, like not just anybody's algorithm. You have to really know the body, almost like Sherlock Holmes, and be very curious. Is that her body knit her pituitary back together?
Mm.
And now she's not on any hormones. I mean, like it's beautiful to see what the body can do. If you give it the right support and you're really paying attention, the body wants to heal. It just needs to know
Mm.
how.
That's so true. My last question. Um, I kind of want to delve a little deeper into something you've touched upon a couple of times, and it's in the book as well. In the book, you say that emotions, the mind body connection, is very powerful,
Hmm.
and that our emotions can even affect our physical health. Can you delve into that a little bit for us?
Sure. I will first say that I'm so grateful you had on Dr. Ashley Ann because she beautifully talks about this.
Mm.
And I want to kind of expand a little bit upon that. But what we are seeing from research and also whether it's, 3D research, if we're looking at even, 5D, if we're thinking about quantum physics, that kind of thing, is that we know even through certain types of research, even like Heart Method Institute, if you've heard of that, like we can actually quantify what's happening in the body when we have an emotion of joy versus an emotion of fear. Even certain tears, like if it's out of sadness, it's gonna actually secrete certain types of hormones or certain
Mm.
types of chemicals. Whereas if we have a tear of joy, it could be something else, and we can actually see this in research. And so, what we really know in medicine now is that our emotions are chemicals. So just by even a thought alone, I mean, think about this. We've all had to have our blood pressure taken before.
Mm.
And I have folks that are like, "Oh my gosh, I've got to go and have my blood pressure taken." And even before just by thought alone, next thing they know, their blood pressure is like 160 over like 95 or something,
Right.
just by thought alone. And so, like, what we know is that we are actually oftentimes with our thoughts, we are making the chemicals. So if we're thinking about, oh gosh, I've got this test coming up, or I've got this next project coming up, and there's anxiety, those stress chemicals are going up. We can actually quantify this. We can look at it even on specialized EEGs and MRIs. We can actually see this, we can quantify it. But even, with heart math, and I'm bringing them up because they can actually quantify when we're connected. They have these random system generators all over the world, and they can tell when we are in heart and brain coherence. So even when we're in coherence with ourselves, heart and brain coherence, right? Versus with another person, they can measure that. I mean, I find that fascinating and
Hmm.
beautiful. And again, going back to what we talked about at the beginning about us being connected, and in the book, I talk about it being the red thread of connection.
Right.
But yeah, our thoughts are so powerful to where we can start wiring and firing the brain in certain ways, and we can actually upregulate our own genes just by an emotion.
Fascinating.
So if we're kind of stuck in an old pattern, we
Mm.
could keep making those same chemicals of stress or those same chemicals of the past of disease. But what I'm trying to help my folks do is start practicing and working on what we call post-traumatic growth or resilience and building that and building the life that they really want.
Fantastic. What a wonderful note to end on. Thank you.
Yeah.
Before you go, though, we have to do the feel good five and hear some of your thoughts on some of these topics because it's
Sure.
always So interesting to hear what our guests have to say. Are you ready for the Feel Good Five?
Sure.
Okay, here we go. What is your favorite feel good song?
Super Bloom by Mr. Wives.
Ooh. What is your favorite feel good movie or TV show?
Modern Family.
Okay. What helps lift you up when you're feeling down?
The three M's: music, movement, and meditation.
Oh, that's good. I like that. What gives your life meaning?
Honestly, seeing people heal. There's just nothing better than it.
Wonderful. And what inspires you?
I think it's kind of the same thing, just seeing people and like living their best life. I mean, I just don't think it gets better than that.
Okay, there's something I really want to bring up before I let you go because this was a really powerful thing that happened in my life about 20 years ago. And I want to hear your perspective on this. My father in his 50s got diagnosed with adrenal sarcoma,
Mhm.
and he was very sick, and he had to go through radiation and chemo. And something interesting happened, which is that my dad is a gardener, and he still went out and planted his garden that year. And the doctor said to him, his oncologist said, when you planted your garden, I was confident you were going to live.
That's
My
right.
dad's still alive today. And he said, when you planted your garden, I felt confident you were going to live, because it really seems like those people who make up their mind they're going to live are so often the ones who pull through. What's your take on that?
Oh, yeah, I see it all the time. And it's when you set your mind on a certain desire or goal and you're rehearsing it, like even paraplegics before they start walking again, they're rehearsing it. They're kind of firing the brain. They're upregulating their chemicals in their brain. They're making basically, even in meditation, we find that you can basically speed up the rate of what your nerves are growing, even with something like meditation. But when you're that clear and you match it with an emotion of gratitude or joy or seeing your grandchildren or your children, like there's something that happens when you really marry an emotion with that rehearsal. But I see it all the time with people. I mean, I have them do it. Like even with Grace, I'm like, okay, what do you want? She told me, I want to see my kids graduate from high school and college and be able to hold my grandbaby. So it's true. It makes a huge difference.
All right. Very good.
It's great, isn't it? The human mind, we still have a long ways to understand, but it can be magic if you know what to do with it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Leah. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you and to gain insight into this fairly new field of study, really. Right? I mean, this is something
Yeah.
that's come about here in the last decade or so, it seems
Yeah.
like.
Yeah, since the Human Genome Project, we can really trace those mutations that we might see, and that's what has allowed us to have this information.
Wonderful. Well, you fill me with a lot of hope. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much.
This show is sponsored by Audible. Did you know that the new movie Project Hail Mary, starring Ryan Gosling, is based on an awesome science fiction novel by Andy Weir, author of The Martian? It's true, and I was lucky enough to get to listen to the audiobook on Audible, and I can highly recommend it. And you know the book is always better than the movie, right? Fans of our show can get a free month of Audible Premium Plus just by clicking the link in our episode description or by visiting the podcast page at matthewvasco.com. Again, that's a free month of Audible Premium Plus by clicking the link in our episode description or by visiting matthewvasco.com and clicking podcast. Choose Project Hail Mary, The Martian, or any one of thousands of titles. This brings us to the end of this episode of It Matters How We Treat One Another. Thank you to our guest, Dr. Leah Hollon. Learn more about Dr. Hollon and her new book, Unwinding the Imprints of Disease, at drleahhollon.com. That's DrLeahhollon.com. I'll put a link in the episode description. Please subscribe to keep up with all of our episodes, and you can support the show on Patreon at patreon.com/itmatterspatrons. That's patreon.com/itmatterspatrons. For less than a venti hot latte at your favorite coffee chain each month, you too can be an It Matters patron and help make our show happen. You can also support us by shopping our Etsy store at etsy.com/shop/itmattersmerch. There are links in the description. And now you can save 10% off merchandise at It Matters Merch by entering the code ITMatters10 at checkout. That's It Matters and the number 10 at checkout. If you want to help reduce hunger around the globe, then please visit WFP.org and give to the World Food Program. That's WFP.org. They are not sponsors of our show. They're simply a cause we truly believe in, because combating hunger is so vitally important. Your quote of the week is, quote, "If trauma can be passed down through generations, then so can healing." End quote. That is from the oft-quoted sage, Unknown. And remember, treat everyone with the core 4 values of kindness, respect, empathy, and compassion, and try for love and acceptance whenever possible, because after all, everybody needs love and acceptance. Be well, and much love to you all.